This week's Top 5 is a whole lot different from the series of weird New England laws, but it was nonetheless difficult to narrow down. As we look at my picks for the top 5 1970s horror movies, and boy, you talk about a broad category to try to nail down to a few entries. Any of the entries on this list, if you haven't seen them, I highly recommend you go and check them out, especially if you like horror movies, obviously. If you don't, some of these I would recommend not checking out. But this top 5, it's a blend of the best 70s horror movies, but also my favorites, which is a way to kind of soften the blow if my top 5 is different from yours, which I'm sure it is. A lot of these movies scarred me as a kid. Let's see how many of them scarred you as a kid if you're of my age or younger. As always with the top 5, there are some honorable mentions to kind of get you ready for the actual top 5. Like I said, this list was hard to narrow down, so I've got several honorable mentions. They include Black Christmas, Carrie, Jaws, The Hills Have Eyes, and the Amityville Horror. Any of those would make a perfect entry on the top 5, and those are some heavy hitters, some legends of horror from the 70s. But I'll try my best to give you my reasoning for the top 5 as we get into it, so let's just do that. Top 5 / my favorite 1970s horror movies, in no particular order, starting with number 1, Halloween. I say no particular order, but the original Halloween is my favorite horror movie ever and one of my favorite movies, period, ever. It is the quintessential suspense horror slasher. The story of Michael Myers, the escaped mental patient from Smith's Grove, Illinois, who heads to his hometown of Haddonfield. He had been in the institution for murdering his sister when he was 6 years old. It's Jamie Lee Curtis's first movie that introduces her as one of the scream queens of horror. And there are so many classic scenes, these suspenseful scenes with that breathing coming from inside the mask, that William Shatner mask that Michael Myers wore. And this was an independent film directed by John Carpenter that made $70 million in 1978 on a budget of $325,000. So you tell me that wasn't a success. Number 2 is The Exorcist. This is another movie that could be your number 1 pick for best horror movie ever, and it would get hardly any arguments. It's from 1973. It's about demonic possession. It stars Linda Blair as little Reagan McNeil, who is possessed and has to get rescued by 2 Catholic priests. Again, some of these scenes in this movie are iconic. That weird crab walk going down the stairs, when little Regan is throwing up the pea soup all over the priests, and the makeup as she gets more and more possessed. The movie was a massive hit, making more than $428 million worldwide back in 1973 into 74 on a budget of only $12 million. And much like Halloween I mentioned before, The Exorcist spawned loads of sequels, some good, some not so good. Much like the next film in this list, number 3, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. When I mentioned about did any of these films scar you as a child, here we go with Exhibit A for me. I saw this movie when I was probably 11 years old, and this was after I had been told during one of my Sunday school classes that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was based on a true story. And I can't remember if it was one of the teachers or if it was just another student. It was probably a student, because I couldn't see a religious education teacher telling the children about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But this movie's from 1974. It's about the Sawyer family, this backwoods, maniac, cannibalistic family in rural Texas. And the group of teens, they go to visit their family's old house way out there in the middle of nowhere, which just happens to be right near the Sawyer family property. For the title, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's surprisingly not that gory. It's a lot of suspense and implied violence. Some of the iconic scenes, like when Leatherface first appears and whacks the guy over the head with the mallet, or hangs the girl from the hook while he cuts up her boyfriend. It scarred me as a child. And again, this spawned loads of sequels. I would have to say the vast majority of them were not that good. But the original still holds up almost 50 years later. Number 4 is Phantasm. This movie's from 1979. It's a mix of sci-fi and horror, with the villain being the tall man who's just horrifying looking, even though he's a real person. So I shouldn't say too much about him because the actor Angus Scrimm wasn't made up too much, so it was basically his real face. This movie centers around the tall man, an evil mortician who is killing and reanimating people in this small town. And he's got his minions that are these small little creatures in robes that almost look like evil Ewoks. And there's this sphere with the blade on it. It's beautifully scary, the way that it's shot and some of the scenery. And the music to it is very haunting. One of the best horror soundtracks there is. It made about $22 million worldwide on a budget of around $300,000 and is 72% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. And this is an underrated horror film that you definitely need to check out. And last but not least, on my list of top 5 favorite/best horror movies of the 1970s, number 5 is Last House on the Left. Rinse and repeat what I said about Texas Chainsaw scarring me as a child. Last House on the Left scarred me as a child as well. The double-edged sword of being allowed to watch horror movies when I was 9, 10, 11 years old is that I was able to be scarred by them as a child as well. This movie came out in 1972 and is directed by Wes Craven, the legend of Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream. And it's horrifying. These 2 teenage girls that are going to a concert looking to score some drugs instead find a gang of escaped convicts and they're tortured and raped and murdered. And that itself is just terrifying. But then the convicts end up seeking refuge in the home of one of the girls that they just killed. And the parents figure out who they are, and then they get their revenge on these convicts. It's so gritty and realistic and horrifying. And it holds up well more than 50 years later. This is a movie that definitely should come with a trigger warning. It's really terrifying. But then again, it's on this list, so I recommend if you enjoy horror and you haven't seen Last House on the Left, definitely check it out. And that wraps up the top 5. Have you seen any of these 1970s horror classics? Halloween, The Exorcist, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Phantasm, Last House on the Left. It's the Halloween season, so you should go and check out at least one of these. And I apologize ahead of time for any nightmares that I give you from this list. I'll try to make sure my next top 5 is more sunshine and rainbows and less murders.